Rome wasn't built in a day. The tortoise beats the hare. More haste, less speed. We've heard the adages and we know why they're used. Behind every success is years of hard work. But how do we ensure that all of that work doesn't just deliver short-term wins, but turns into long-term growth? And how do we define the impact and returns? Today we answer the big question: how do you build for long-term success?
We have a better foundation to again capitalize on that opportunity, that growth.
Vision is almost everything, and leadership is almost everything.
Fans will drive the long-term success of any league. If you have no fans, you have no league.
If you change nothing, nothing will change. And I think one of the hardest things to do is recognizing for long-term success, you need to change things.
Hello and welcome to the Green Room by Deloitte. I'm Steph Dobbs, and for this first episode back to the studio in 2025, I am joined by the lovely Lizzie Elston. How are you doing, Lizzie?
Hey, Steph, I'm good, thank you.
Happy New Year.
And to you.
Probably a bit late. Probably not.
That.
Anyway, today we are going to be exploring some of the secrets to long-term success. So I'm sure one of the points that we are going to get around to talking about is making sure that you listen to consumer demand. So on that note, I'm very excited to say that you can not only watch The Green Room by Deloitte now on YouTube, but also on Spotify. Woohoo. Indeed. But of course, if you prefer to listen to it in audio, then do not worry, you can still listen to it as that option as well. But on to today's topic. So we're looking at the path to long-term success. Is slow and steady the best approach to achieving lasting success? Or are there quick wins that can accelerate things? Today we look to answer the big question: how do you build long-term success? So Lizzie, who are we joined by?
So I'm delighted. Today we are joined by Nikki Doucet, who is CEO of Women's Professional Leagues Limited, the body that runs the top tiers of women's football in England. Welcome, Nikki.
Thank you.
And also Scott Campbell, partner at Deloitte and leader of Deloitte's Ventures team. Hi, Scott.
Hi there, lovely to be here.
And you, thank you for coming. So let's start right at the beginning and set the scene. Nikki, can you tell us a bit about your role and what you've been doing since you took it on in 2023?
Thank you, yes. So I am CEO of what we're calling Women's Professional Leagues Limited, which is overseeing the top two professional leagues for women's football in this country. So the Women's Super League and the Women's Championship. Previously, the leagues had been owned by the FA, and as of last summer, we became an independent company for the first time ever, which is actually pretty incredible. So you have to think about, in a different analogy, it's like when the Premier League first started. We're at that stage of the game. So it feels really exciting, and we're on an incredible growth journey.
Excellent, and we're looking forward to hearing more about that. And Scott, can you tell us a little bit more about Deloitte Ventures and what you do?
Yeah, sure. So I have the great pleasure of working with organisations that recognise the future needs something slightly different, often a different approach or a different way of capturing that value, and we help organisations get there. Often that's called a venture or a startup mentality, but it's at the heart recognising that long-term success is about doing things differently, and that has to be slightly separate from the business today, which is often short-term success focused.
So I suppose whichever sort of part of a journey you're on and you're looking to grow a business, it's very easy to get sort of stuck in the everyday, the day-to-day side of things. But how important is a long-term vision, let's say, when you're starting out with things? How do you actually balance that with the short-term and the sort of quick wins? I don't know. Nikki, do you want to maybe start on that one?
I think it's actually the main reason we got the transaction done. So it was a complicated transaction because we have 12 teams in the WSL, all at, different ownership groups, different structures. There's 12 teams, or now 11 teams in the Women's Championship. Again, different ownership structures, different phases of the journey, if you will. And we have the FA, which is obviously the governing body of football. And so getting everybody to align on what the direction should be is, really hard. So I think the main reason we actually got the transaction done is because we started first and foremost was what's the purpose, what's the vision, what's the mission. And I think because we could always align and go back to this is what we're trying to do, then we can figure out how and what we get into the weeds and the details of how you actually execute against that. Because there's going to be, stops and starts, test and learn. Again, we are, I would say, in the startup journey of the commercial phase of growth for women's football. So again, we're guided by a bigger purpose. which is to leverage the power of women's football to inspire a more equitable society. Our vision is women's football transformed, so we're going on this transformational journey, and everybody who works in women's football can apply that thinking. But our mission really is to create the most distinctive, competitive, and entertaining women's football club competition in the world, which theoretically becomes the most valuable women's sports league in the world, period.
It's actually really interesting to hear you talk about those three things, because I think people often confuse, hang on, what's purpose, what's mission, what's vision, what's strategy, what's plan, and the way you've just articulated that is really helpful. And Scott, what about yourself, sort of long-term vision and how you balance that with the short term?
I think I can't remember exactly who it is, I think it might be Bill Gates' quote, which is, we continually overestimate the change in 2 years and underestimate the change in 10. When you're aiming for that longer term 10-year horizon, vision is almost everything, and leadership is almost everything. And I think I'm right in saying, Nikki, that you received from Barclays the biggest investment in women's sport globally.
Yes.
They don't invest in spreadsheets to do that. They look at the financial acumen, but they are following what I would call your intent, which is an equation which most organisations would say it's the vision of where you're going to go. You need to sell them a dream about where women's football's going, how you plan to get there as an organisation, and what's the incentive for all parties to get there. Organisations that align that intent, far more likely to be successful. And I think people invest in intent. They like to back it up with spreadsheets, but they invest in your intent. So for me, long-term leadership is about aligning that intent.
And I suppose on that point then, how do you actually define success? I mean, both at personal level, but also within an organisation. Nikki, how are you defining success? What does that look like?
There's sort of different ways, but I think for us, it's success over the next. It's creating an investable proposition first and foremost. We need to enable more investment to come into the game, because there has been historic underinvestment, as we all know, hopefully the history of women's football in this country. But for us, what it means, right now there's more girls participating in football in this country than there are boys and girls playing rugby. Wow. And so we have an incredible foundation that is off the success of the Lionesses and the inspiration that they brought. And so we had a real spark, for a catalyst for growth, if you will. And success in the future is, one, enabling a talent pathway for those girls to continue to play football. So more facilities, more investment, more facilities for her, more stadiums that work for her, more access to infrastructure and resource, and then there's a professional game that continues to employ more women to play football, more coaches, more referees at the highest standard in the world. And success for us, that means there's going to be 5 million people coming to watch a WSL game in the next decade annually. So we're at 1 million today, and we see that growing, significantly in the future.
Yeah, and that, what you've just sort of been talking about there, it takes us on, I think, to the discussion around responsible growth, because it's not just about profit, it's about these things that you've been articulating, Nikki. And so if we can now maybe talk a bit about that idea, and we hear about it more and more, don't we, responsible growth, and it would be interesting to kind of hear what it means to you and how important it is in creating value as a business. Scott, can you kick us off?
Yeah, I have a very clear sort of view of this, and sort of leading into the long-term growth and success, often organisations have sort of very clear attributes. One of them is they have to be sustainable, and I think that is from every aspect of financial sustainable, from the people that they involve, and it has to leave things better than they picked up. And that isn't always how businesses operate in the short term. And I agree with what you said, Nikki, that you have to have very different things you measure. I think I've even heard you say you need to be able to measure the sort of health and fitness from women in physiotherapy on the high street, right? Like that is an outcome of what you're looking to drive. When you have those different metrics, you behave slightly differently. And I think that responsible leadership is about driving to a slightly different set of metrics. And it's interesting if you look at the CEO of organizations, they feel that more keenly than the rest of the C-suite, because they believe that the future is about different things, measuring different outcomes and achieving more than you could have thought possible, not just managing to the latest free cash flow spreadsheet, which is important, but that isn't vision and leadership. So for me, responsibility leadership is about creating a sustainable business which leaves things better than when you pick them up.
And Nikki, you sort of alluded to earlier the fact that we're in the sort of early days when it comes to women's football, but obviously things are in a very strong position. What specific sort of opportunities do you see for growth within the game, and how are you approaching them?
So I worked at Nike for a long time, and I'd say one of the biggest things I learned working there was you have to obsess the consumer and what the consumer needs. And ultimately, it's a product that the consumer is watching, buying. So for me, it's about investing in that, I say quotes in product, because a lot of times a lot of the core fans don't like it being referred to as a product. But that to me means the players. We need better players, investment to allow them to be the best possible footballer they can be. Because if we have more great players, more teams with interesting rivalries, like our consumer wants to see awesome players, awesome football, great rivalries, games of consequence. And if we invest in building the best version of that and the infrastructure behind that and obsess that, the commercial elements and everything will come. The fans, if we don't invest in that and we continue to, I do think it's a lot about prioritization and being very clear, because there's so many things we could be doing right now, especially as we're starting the organization as a new standalone entity, if you will. And so it's being very clear on our strategic priorities and what is the outcome. So the growth, the attendance, the viewership, I think is an outcome of, do we have the best, most competitive league with the best players in the world, the best coaches in the world, the best referees in the world. And so that's at the moment where our focus is, and where should investment go to drive that. And it's hard because a lot of times I think an early stage of industry or in this stage of maturity, there's a lot of short-term financial pressure, but ultimately we need to make decisions that are setting this up, in particular because it's a sport and it has such emotional importance to everybody, to our country. We're trying to set it up for the next 30, 40, 50 years. We're trying to be really thoughtful around where that investment goes. But for me, it's the talent pathway. It's making sure we have the ecosystem of women's football and the pyramid is supported properly and has the right investment at each level, and that the economic model at each level works. Because today it's still being developed. So in some ways it's almost a top-down approach, and we need to flip it so the bottom is as successful as where the top is, but the top has to be successful to also fund that. So it's a circle, and
I guess it's quite an iterative process, isn't it?
It is,
because
and it's
like
complex.
invest, but then you have to build up before you get the investment.
But ultimately, if we have the best talent pathway in the world, we're going to have a great England team. We're going to have players that are going to want to come here, having the best infrastructure, the best sports science for her, the best coaching, and getting talent, more time with great coaching, ultimately is going to create better football that we all want to watch.
Nikki, hearing you talk about that and the way in which it's all going to evolve, obviously it's analogous with other businesses and other startups, but I just wondered how much also you learn from other sports or sectors more broadly. What kind of do you take learnings from, and where do you sort of take inspiration from? Or in fact, do you actually just come to the conclusion that women's football has to carve its own path and have its own way?
Oh no, I think you get inspiration and learnings from as many places as possible. Yeah, so we've looked at, leagues, different sports around the world, what's successful, what's not. There's a lot of interesting things that are going on, a lot of non-traditional leagues that are being set up and having success, understanding the different markets. So obviously the US market and North American market is a different culture for sport, a different market versus over here, understanding the market over here and also broader European. And then we have a global fan base. So, it's been interesting because we have the most foreign players in our league. And so it's been interesting to understand the dynamics around the world, how they engage, what they want to see. But absolutely, I think you have to take learnings from as many places as possible and understand what has worked, what hasn't worked, test and learn. Hopefully, I've said this before, but fail fast, fail cheaply, move forward.
Yes.
But I think what I'm hopeful for as we continue to develop the culture of our organization is that we aren't afraid to fail. Hopefully we don't fail too big or anything like that, but we have to be trying new things. And there is a mindset that we have to look at this through the lens of women's football, which is a different sport, a different product, a different version of football. The experience of being a female athlete is a different experience than being a male athlete. It's a different fan base with different behaviors, a different heritage, different history. And so you can't apply the same model to something else, to this. And I think a lot of women's football has been set up to look like men's football, and I think that's the big learning and the opportunity is what is right for our audience, what is right for our ecosystem, where does investment have to come into? And to me, that's the exciting thing. It continues to be an opportunity and an underserved audience, and that to me is a massive business opportunity, which coupled with my purpose and having been an athlete myself, although not professional, I always wanted to be, but that's my passion, and so I love that part of it. But the business side is equally so intriguing, so challenging, so exciting, that those two things together, it's just an incredible opportunity.
Definitely. And I suppose you can't grow as an organisation, of course, without the sort of customers and the consumers. So maybe, Scott, if we come to you, if we're knowing that consumers are making more decisions based around values, so we talked a little bit before around responsible growth, is that important to them as well? Is it important to employees, let's say, of an organisation?
I think what's really important to consumers is, and you mentioned it, Nikki, is customer obsession of the business. I think that there's a huge amount to be said for creating a product that people want. And to do that, you need to be obsessed. And I love the phrase customer obsession. A lot of businesses use the phrase customer centric, and it almost loses it a little bit. It's sort of, you need to be obsessed with that customer. In fact, it's probably one of the 5 hallmarks of organizations that drive long-term value, which is you have to be absolutely crystal clear, what is it your customers want? And customers want that. Part of that is listening to them about what sustainability means, what responsible business means, but most of all is about, is this doing something that I want and I want to see? And I think that, I could argue the different philosophies of economics, but I think we've lost it slightly where shareholder value trumps customer obsession and delivering something fantastic for the customer. And I would like to see a shift much more back to creating great businesses, doing great things for your customer, and raises everyone up. Whereas the obsession with profit for the shareholder is important, but that should happen along the way.
And do you see that shift happening today?
Certainly, I think you see more business leaders than ever. And it's important to probably bring out the problem that Nikki faces into and all business faces into, which is in a survey of 700 business leaders, that 85% of them agree, and they agree on nothing, that doing things very differently is the key to long-term success. In that same survey, 78% of them say they will struggle to do anything differently. And that is the key you lean into. And I'm so happy, Nikki, to hear you talk about you're in the startup phase, you're test and learn, adaptable. Those tend to be more hallmarks of what long-term success can look like. Extremely difficult in business to get that to work. And I'll just say, from having made New Year's resolutions, also extremely difficult on a personal level to get that to work. I make bold commitments to myself about things are going to change, and they don't really change. And facing into that are words like vision-led leadership, around adaptability, customer obsession, ecosystem, and then sort of culture and talent for that. Those are the 5 hallmarks, which is just so pleasing to hear. That's the core tenets of how you set up the organisation.
And customers, consumers, we're talking about fans, I guess,
yes.
Nikki, for women's football, very much at the heart, clearly. With so many teams to manage, you obviously have a lot of stakeholders. Why are fans such a crucial part of it all?
Fans will drive the long-term success of any league. If you have no fans, you have no league. So that was the very first thing we did, even before the company was officially incorporated last summer. We had previous fan research, which was more quantitative, but we hadn't done any qualitative fan research. So we did a very deep dive on fan insights starting last year this time, where we hired an agency, Ruby Studio, and we went into the market, did over 150 hours of interviews, ages 10 all the way to 60, all across the country. Hopefully we captured the broad population. to understand our fans and to simplify our segmentation analysis, which previously I think we had 7 or 8 different segments. Now we have 3. And what was interesting is actually the grouping. What we learned is that the fans we couldn't group them by demographics. That wasn't the commonality. It was their relationship to football. So it's a mindset-based segmentation approach, and in particular their relationship to men's football, which is interesting. And so we have 3 segments now, and a deep dive and understanding of each of those, and we can communicate that with our clubs, because there's a big group that has never watched men's football before. You know,
they've come into watching
women's. So they're coming in to watch women's. They've come in through the
really
Lionesses. We call them the free fan because they are free or untethered from the men's game. So they don't know the tribalism. They don't know the heritage. They're still learning some of the rules. So, you know, some of them will say, you know, I don't understand some of the commentary on the TV because I'm still learning, and I love the players and I love their personalities, and I loved the Euros and I loved that feeling, and I feel actually more comfortable in this environment than I might in men's football for various reasons. And so we're learning a lot about this fan base and what they need, and the type of content and an atmosphere that they want is different than maybe for another sport. And so we're all learning, okay, how do we serve that while maintaining our core fan who, you know, obsesses it, loves it, watches it day in, day out, understands the technical elements of it, and wants something potentially a little bit different than what a new fan or the free fan might want. So building a strategy around that. But again, it starts with the fans, understanding what they are, listening, hearing them, what I think is not necessarily going to be the right strategy. It's what, you know, are we building something that makes sense for them? And then understanding, what do the clubs need from us? As a league, how do we have empathy for the clubs to grow? And if we're doing our job, we have to grow the entire pie. So if one club is being successful but nobody else is, that is not a great strategy. We have to make sure that everybody is growing their fan base. Everybody is growing and building, you know, their structure to capitalize on the opportunity in front of us. And that is building a fan base that wants to come each week and wants to watch, wants to engage. And so it's, again, keep saying it, but it starts with, you know, understanding the fans.
Definitely.
Absolutely.
I'm also really relieved to hear I'm not the only one with the rules, to be perfectly honest. It sounds like lots of people have still got questions as well. Great.
I feel like that about so many sports. I can still enjoy it though. Like
Exactly,
I love
still
watching
appreciate
rugby.
it.
I haven't got a clue what they're all doing when they all have that lovely hug in the middle of the field.
You should feel it's for everybody, it's for you. So it shouldn't, especially from a sport perspective. And what's interesting about, for me, for women's football is that most, if not all, female athletes understand what it feels like to be marginalized and to fight for wanting to play. And so that is not an exclusive environment. That is, you know, these players are playing as their authentic self for the true love of the game, the joy of playing football. And that is an environment that's inclusive for anybody, you know, and that to me is super exciting. And that's what it should feel like, and it should feel good to come and watch. It should feel good to understand the players and still get into the rivalries of like, okay, this is competitive sport. I still want to win.
Yes.
But it's doing it in a way that actually is inclusive then for everybody, and you're still creating that emotion that we all want. But that's why I love it.
And if I just build on that, Nikki, you'd be amazed at how many conversations in the business world start with, we want to achieve very different outcomes. We want to do things that we've never done before, and we're going to do that by doing things exactly the same way that we've always done it. And I think that having that vision and tweaking a few little things, like I've loved how you've gone for YouTube partnerships and how you've found a slightly different demographic, the way you talked about your customer segmentation being very different. I think, you know, we try and get a lot of business leaders to get a tattoo of, if you change nothing, nothing will change. And I think one of the hardest things to do is recognizing, for long-term success, you need to change things. And that's where customer obsession, listening to your audience and understanding where to meet them is so important. And I think you've achieved, is it 100,000 plus YouTube subscribers already, which is incredible organic growth.
More than that.
And a sign of a great product is something that achieves that organic growth. People, word of mouth, want to get involved with it and want to partake in it.
Yeah, for us it's more accessibility. The shift to YouTube was a really important one, and it allowed us to understand also the international opportunity and the international reach of our league. So when you watched one of the Brighton Man City games, the entire chat in YouTube was in Japanese. So again, it's a younger audience. It skews almost 50-50 male-female.
Oh, that's interesting.
Which
is
is
that right?
Yeah, which is really interesting. So again, it's skewing some of our bias. Like even the free fan, we thought in our research, our initial hypothesis was that's a Gen Z female. And actually it isn't. Every single demographic is within the free fan. It does skew a little female based on the research we have. But again, you have males within that might not have found what they were looking for in different sports and are finding something really interesting here. So,
well, I can certainly say my husband was screaming and excited about the Euros, the women's final, as he is when he's supporting his beloved Liverpool men's. You know, there is something right for everybody.
Yes. And now we're building, this is in some ways the first generation of fandom for women's football. We don't have that intergenerational fandom. This is the first, generation of that. And that's, again, this is a lifelong, like, you'll never forget that moment where you were, that emotion that you felt, and the pride and the joy, and the opportunity for that to continue to then come into the league, and then to continue to, have a great England team. It's really exciting.
What do Nigella, Ed Balls and Gordon Brown have in common? They've all contributed to Soup for Good, a cookbook for a cause. It's been created by Cook for Good, a social enterprise Deloitte are proud to support as part of our social impact programme, 5 Million Futures. Every purchase supports the incredible work that they do, tackling food insecurity, social isolation and barriers to work on a social housing estate in London. Find the Soup for Good cookbook on the Cook for Good website and discover how a simple, delicious bowl of soup can make a world of difference. Head to cookforgood.uk.
I suppose maybe building on that point then around that momentum that sort of has come from the Lionesses then, and as to Lizzie's point, the sort of the fond memories that we all have around that. How do you actually seize on that momentum to drive everything forward? How do you turn that into something to push into the future? Where do you start with that?
I think it's taking the fans that loved the Lionesses and follow it and help them continue to follow their favorite player through the league, so that they don't have to just watch them when they're playing for England. They can watch them during the league, help them find a club they might want to support, a supporters group within the clubs that is a community that maybe they didn't know existed and want to join, and that feels really good, and they're part of something that is developing friendships and community and support. So, I think for us, it's continuing to understand all of those fans, help them find what club they want to follow, what player they want to follow, and make it as easy as possible to follow them the way they want to follow them. So whether that's on YouTube or on BBC or on Sky, wherever they are, our league should be there in the right way, telling the right stories that is interesting to continue to drive that.
Yeah. And Scott, how can, just talking about that sort of seizing momentum and driving it forward, how can organisations kind of plan responsibly but still leave space to adapt and respond to quick momentum?
Well, it's probably just about the hardest question that a business leader has to face, which is how do I balance today and the future? And there's probably two ways to do that. You can either bet on the future, which is the realm of the venture capitalist, and understanding I'm going to take a big position, I've seen where things are going, and I'm going to bet on the future. Or you can balance your way there. And I think the luxury is having leadership and shareholders, which in the case of the clubs are all aligned around that balance. We have to make money today and make progress today, and we're building for a long-term success. The second route, the balance, is extraordinarily difficult to achieve. We can measure everything down to the nth degree in the short term, and that tends to be the easiest thing to measure. So you measure that, and then when you make investments, they produce more of that free cash flow, return on investment. And actually it's the aspects which are slightly longer term, harder to measure, performance indicators or goals, which always lead to that long-term success. And it's interesting that I work with two types of businesses that do that really well. Family owned. because they think in generations, and it tends to be infrastructure businesses. They say, Scott, we think in quarterly investment cycles. And I say, well, that's not too abnormal. And they say, no, we mean quarter centuries. So it tends to be businesses that take that longer term view of success, like you have to in generating sport, and balance it with how you actually bring everyone up to date and align everyone around that. That's the hard thing in business to do. It's easy to bet. The problem is that if you get that wrong, it doesn't help anyone. So betting for venture capitalists and balance for leaders and successful into the future.
When you say the bet idea, it's like taking the risk, isn't it? And Nikki, I mean, I guess CEO as you are, there's an element of risk taking. I guess that's part and parcel of the job.
The phase I think we're in now is the scale up, build the foundation phase. And when I think about the investment that we've had coming in, so we've had some incredible proof points. So like you mentioned, Barclays has come in and a significant increase to their initial investment. We've had Sky and BBC renew their media rights deal, which starts next year, and it's an uplift again. And the investment I think that they will do as we think about the production increase, where we need to invest to create a better product on TV, the investment that we'll use from Barclays to continue to invest in the football, in our league, the capabilities that we need to help the clubs grow. We're setting it up so that for the next cycles, again, we're building the foundation. So if the Lionesses win the Euros again, we'll have
when they win the Euros.
Exactly, yes. When they win the Euros again, we have a better foundation to, again, capitalize on that opportunity, that growth, more people watching, bringing them in, helping them find the right team, the right player for them to connect to. I think that's how we're thinking through it. So we have to prioritize that foundation element and that scale up, knowing that, the value, the real value that we're all trying to achieve. But I agree with you, we are in the venture stage of it, and understanding which KPIs are important to track in the short term right now. What success looks like today will be different than what success will look like in 4 years, 5 years from now. And so we're trying to be very thoughtful around that.
Yeah. And what would those type of KPIs be, perhaps? Are you looking at things like revenue? As I'm sort of sure Deloitte's put out some recent research around sort of what the revenues look like. Yeah. What are the sort of immediate KPIs you keep an eye on?
So as I think about game development, competition delivery, and then create demand and drive value. So a revenue is hugely important on the commercial side and ultimately driving value. And I believe most startup businesses, when you think about a growth business, you have to think about, are you driving revenue going forward? So that is definitely a key KPI for the league, but also for all of the clubs. And I think, with the Deloitte report that's just come out saying a top line growth of 35% for club revenue for women's football year over year, there's very few industries that have that type of top line growth. I've always said, if you look at our growth metrics and remove the words women's football, we look like a high growth industry. But I think there still is this value perception because you have the word women's in front of the word football. So I would like to see that change in the future. But when I think about other KPIs, I think about what percent of Lionesses are playing in our league, because that's really important to the fan base and really important to our clubs. What percent of players are in EA's team of the year or in the Ballon d'Or, top players in the world? I think about our quality of play, and is our league becoming more competitive? So the margin of win and goals scored. So those are the types of, I think, key KPIs around, is our football the best possible football it can be? And so when we think about what we're delivering there, and then viewership, obviously, global views, the engagement, and the key metrics I think that women's sport should be looked at, because our players and our clubs tend to have higher engagement. So the value of one female fan is not necessarily the same value as one male fan, and it's trying to educate, I think, the broader industry around understanding our fan base and how then they monetize that fan base and how they serve them product that they might want to buy. So like merch, I think, is a great example. What merch might the free fan want to buy versus a traditional male fan? It might be different. And there might be opportunities, or the food and beverage opportunities at stadiums, the secondary spend opportunity that I just think is untapped at the moment. I think but again, going back to understanding what does our fan base want, and are we serving them what they're asking for?
Definitely. And I suppose I'd quite like to reflect, both of you perhaps, sort of around lessons learnt, let's say, so far in sort of both of your worlds. So when it comes to sort of planning for this sustained growth, Nikki, let's start with you and then we'll go on to you, Scott. Any sort of, lessons that you've learned that you think would be helpful for others to hear?
Lessons learned for me is really being able to articulate the purpose, vision, mission, and why those are important. I think being very clear on what the strategic priorities are, and there's so much, and being ruthless around what are the two things, if we just focus on these two things and build our organization around that are the things that ultimately create the outcome that we want, which is more fans, higher revenue. What are those two things? And I think my role is trying to continue to simplify so that it's easy for the organization to then build plans against those key things that are going to ultimately drive the value.
I think there's a huge amount of lesson learned, and we need to do away with the perception that we as humans are linear thinkers. And what that means is doing what we've always done will get us to that bold future growth position. And I think that often I joke with some of the companies I work with that a number of these growth-focused ventures are sort of 5 to 10 year overnight successes. At least that's the perception of them. That in 5 years' time, it will be viewed as, where did this come from? What a wonderful overnight success this was. And what they fail to see is the balance and the investment that needed to be taken now. And that's why I'm so glad to hear people talk about in the startup phase, in the venture phase, learning, understanding the metrics that are leading indicators of that growth. Like you said, 35% in any industry growth is a fantastic thing. So my lesson learned is it's all about what you measure and how you focus on it. And I think the mindset of future success is very different to success today. Being able to balance that in your shareholders, in your employees, in your customers, is a difficult thing to do, because you sometimes need to persuade them, no, it is important to take from what we're doing today to invest in what will enable us in the future. It has to be said, with all the spreadsheets we have and all the media attention, very difficult, because someone will always criticize something you're changing today, which is non-traditional, to invest in the future. So having that steel to maintain the 5 year overnight success that you're heading towards is very important. So mindset and determination, I think, are two big lessons there.
Before we start wrapping up, I'm really keen to explore the M&A aspects of all of this, because Nikki, just talking to you earlier about what it must have been like to kind of combine the women's leagues and all the different desires from so many different teams. Can you just give us a little bit of an overview of that whole process of getting sort of 23 clubs, I think?
Yes, well, having worked in investment banking for almost a decade and working on lots of M&A transactions, I would say this was by far the most complex M&A transaction I've ever worked on. So when you think about getting 23 clubs at different points of maturity, let's say, for women's football, plus the FA, the governing body, which has a particular role to play, obviously, in football in this country, getting them all to sign the same legal document was a mammoth task, and everyone on our working group can attest to. But again, I think, understanding what the red lines were, understanding what was important for each side to fight for and where their red lines were, constant communication, going back to the purpose of why we're doing this, and I think then just setting deadlines and being very, very clear on those, and just massive project management and clear communication and being strategic, I think, around making sure each decision maker, each club had what they needed, and the FA had what they needed to make sure that they all signed the same legal documents to incorporate the company.
Mammoth task, but well done for getting there with it all.
I would like to have been at the post-deal party. I can only imagine.
Yes, level of exhaustion after that.
It was good, let's just say
I
that.
I would hope so.
And Scott, in your world, I suppose, what role can mergers and acquisitions play in sort of creating responsible growth for organisations?
I think it's one of the tools that we have open to creating that growth for the long term. And again, I fall back to what you measure is really important. I'm sure when you were in the middle of the transaction, Nikki, that you would have thought surely there was an easier way to do this. And I think that's the danger, because sometimes there is an easier way to do it. Some business leaders will say, don't worry about the future long-term success, I'll buy my way to it through an M&A transaction. M&A is the tool. You need to have the leadership, the adaptability, the customer centricity. And I think executing the right deal, not the easy deal, one that you don't necessarily always measure on a spreadsheet, but actually you measure by intent of what you're trying to achieve, that's always the more valuable deal.
So as we start to get towards the big question of the episode, I wondered, Nikki, if you had to just share some advice with others who are about to embark on a long-term journey to success, what would it be?
I think for any business, I think understanding what your product is, what your consumer base is, being really thoughtful around that, and hiring great people. You know, it's around, I'm really lucky. I have a fantastic team who are passionate, who care deeply around growing the women's game in the right way. We have shared values, so we're still defining, I'd say, the values of our organization that will help, I think, us create the culture and behaviors that we want, that aren't just words on a wall, that is lived, and that we will pass on as the team evolves and grows in the future. And I think if you have that, if you're hiring great people and you're giving them the tools they need to be successful, ultimately, I think most businesses, if you have a great team, that's ultimately what drives success. I'm a big beneficiary of having a great team and taking on a great team. I do have to give kudos to the FA, obviously. All of their investment to get women's football, and all of the clubs, their investment to get women's football to the place that it is today. For me to be just it's such a privilege to be in this role, and it's a deep responsibility, because I always say I stand on the shoulders of giants, and I do. And it's about the people. The people are the ones that drive it forward, and we're not always going to get it right. We have to problem solve. So my advice is, the biggest advice I would say is hire great people.
Right. Love it. And Scott, what's one thing that businesses should be focusing on right now as they look at their growth strategies?
It's one thing. It's always difficult to boil it down to one thing.
Well, you have to.
And I think I would probably use the word bravery. Building towards a future you believe in requires bravery, and it requires engendering that bravery in the teams around you. It takes a lot to stand up and say, I think we need to do this differently. I think the future is about different things. There are so many who would disagree with you and say, well, look at all of the examples of the past. So don't forget that it's about bravery as well.
I like that.
Right. Love it. So that, of course, means that it's finally time to wrap up the episode and answer our big question, which in many ways I hope you've already answered throughout this episode, but let's come to you first, Scott. How do you build long-term success?
I think long-term success is a different beast to short-term success. And if we've learned anything looking at this over the last 20, 25 years, I would say zoom out and zoom in. So long-term success is about zooming out to create a vision of the future that you believe will exist, and then zooming in to say, well, what 2-3 things do I have to do today to get me on that journey? And that may not be the traditional things. So I would say zoom out, zoom in is the key to building long-term success. Difficult to balance, but definitely don't bet and take big bets on the zoom out.
Okay. And Nikki?
I guess I'd answer that by saying, understand your why, know who you're serving, and figure out the 1 or 2, maybe 3 strategic priorities of how you're going to do that.
Thank you so much for spending time with Lizzie and I today, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much. It's been great.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Green Room by Deloitte. We release a new episode every other Tuesday with another big question. So don't forget to hit follow or subscribe to this podcast wherever you're listening or watching. And that way you'll be alerted whenever a new episode drops. This podcast is produced by our very own Pod Squad. Original music by Ali Barrett.